Mahoney drove Eleanor to her sister's place in Evanston without telling her why. She didn't push. After 22 years, she'd learned to read the particular silence that meant real danger, the kind that arrived before the explanations did. He carried her bag to the porch. The November wind came off the lake hard and cold. She touched his face at the door. He told her it was precautionary. She told him that word had never once meant what he wanted it to mean. He kissed her forehead. She held his wrist a moment longer than necessary. He didn't look back when he reached the car. He sat there for a full minute with the engine running, watching the porch light come on behind the curtained glass. He thought about the phone call, a man's voice, calm, knowing his address, knowing Eleanor's name. He pulled away from the curb and drove back toward the city and whatever was already waiting for him there. The call came at 2:15 in the morning. A patrolman, young, voice cracking on the line. Alley off Maxwell near the old pushcart lots. Mahoney dressed in the dark and drove south through streets that were wet and empty. He smelled it before he cleared the alley mouth. Copper and cold air and something else beneath it, something organic and final. The body was face down against the brick, both hands extended as if reaching for a door that wasn't there. Mahoney crouched. He knew the coat. Brown twill with the collar frayed on the left side. He turned the body carefully. Darnell Briggs, 41 years old, worked produce by day, talked to Mahoney by arrangement on the second Tuesday of every month in exchange for small protections and smaller cash. He'd been reliable for 4 years. He'd never asked for anything extra. Mahoney looked down at him for a long time. The patrolman said something. Mahoney told him quietly to step back. The crime scene photographer was still setting up when Mahoney checked the coat pockets. Standard procedure. Left exterior pocket empty. Right exterior, a matchbook from a restaurant on North Clark. Interior breast pocket was where his fingers stopped. He drew it out slowly. A single leaf, dried and pressed flat. Dark reddish-brown at the edges where the blood had soaked in and dried. Autumn oak, same as the others. Same careful placement. But this one had been folded once, lengthwise, a deliberate crease down the center vein. None of the previous leaves had been folded. Mahoney held it under the patrolman's flashlight. The fold changed the message. He didn't know how he knew that, but he knew it the way you knew a word in a foreign language you'd never studied but somehow recognized. This wasn't just a signature anymore. This was correspondence. Darnell Briggs had known Mahoney personally. This leaf had been left for Mahoney specifically. The killer was talking directly to him now. He went to the records clerk, a thin man named Pulaski who owed Mahoney 3 favors and was down to his last one. He gave Pulaski a list of corporate names he'd pulled from a 2-year-old Tribune financial column and a tip from Darnell Briggs that now felt prophetic. Pulaski came back in 90 minutes with incorporation documents, ownership transfers, and a set of city contract awards from 1948 through 1951. Mahoney spread them across an empty interview table and began tracing the lines. 3 shell companies, 2 dissolved within months of receiving municipal contracts, 1 still active, registered to a holding firm with an address on LaSalle Street that Mahoney recognized as a building owned by a man whose name appeared in no newspaper but whose influence appeared in many decisions. The contracts were sanitation, then road repair, then something vague listed as civic infrastructure improvement. The money moved in one direction. The companies vanished. The contracts delivered nothing verifiable. Someone had been paid enormously to do very little, and that someone was protecting the arrangement with extraordinary violence. The name was Harlan Voss, not a politician, not a judge, something more durable than either. Voss had operated in Chicago's financial architecture since before the war, always at one remove from anything visible, always with 3 legitimate businesses between himself and the transaction in question. He sat on no boards publicly. He attended no functions on record, but Mahoney had found his signature now in 7 documents across 4 different municipal departments, always through intermediaries, always yielding profit that was never traced back cleanly. 2 of the victims had worked adjacent to those contracts. A third had filed a complaint with the city assessor's office 18 months ago and been quietly dismissed. Darnell Briggs had, Mahoney now recalled with a sickening clarity, mentioned a name once, casually, almost incidentally, at the end of a meeting 14 months ago. He hadn't followed up. He hadn't written it down. Harlan Voss was the kind of name that made aldermen change the subject, made lawyers develop selective amnesia, made captains look out windows and talk about difficult decisions. He noticed the Ford coupe on the second morning. Dark green, dented rear quarter panel parked 2 blocks south of wherever Mahoney happened to be. It was too consistent to be coincidence and too careful to be amateur. He drove a deliberate loop through the south side that afternoon, varying speed, taking turns without signaling, and the Ford stayed with him at a distance that showed discipline. Back at the precinct, he said nothing. He went to the washroom and stood at the sink with the water running and thought about who in this building would have assigned a tale to a detective working a homicide case. Reardon was a possibility, but not a certainty. Someone above Reardon was equally possible. Someone outside the department entirely was the answer he kept returning to. That meant the surveillance on him had begun before his conversation with Reardon. That meant his movements had already been of interest to someone. That meant Voss, or whoever worked for Voss, had eyes inside this building or close enough to it to make no practical difference. He left his car in the precinct lot and walked out the back entrance through the evidence lockup, exiting onto a side street through a door that required a specific key and the patience of the property clerk, who nodded without comment. He walked 3 blocks to a diner on Wabash, ate eggs he didn't taste, waited 20 minutes, then took a cab north. He got out on Michigan and walked west, cutting through a hotel lobby, exiting on the parallel street, catching another cab going south, then west again on foot for 6 blocks. It was cold enough that his breath came in visible bursts. His hands were stiff inside his gloves. He checked behind him twice, naturally, the way any pedestrian might. The green Ford was not there. No substitute was obvious. He was either clean or the replacement was very good. He decided to operate as if he were clean, which was perhaps exactly what the replacement wanted him to decide. He kept moving anyway. He had an address. He had 1 week. He couldn't afford the luxury of complete certainty. He was at his desk with 2 cracked ribs taped by a doctor who asked no questions when the phone rang at 9:30. Eleanor. Her voice carried the particular controlled steadiness she used when she was managing something difficult. She asked if he was all right. He said yes in a way that she correctly interpreted as mostly. She said she'd found something in the coat he'd left hanging in their hall closet, the gray wool one he'd worn Thursday. He asked what. She said a folded piece of paper, handwritten, that looked like an address and a date. He sat up straighter despite the ribs. He asked her to read it. She read an address on the north side, a date 3 days from now, and 2 words beneath it that she said she didn't understand. He asked her to repeat the 2 words. She did. He was quiet. She asked what they meant. He said he wasn't sure yet, which was the partial truth. The full truth was that the address corresponded to a location connected to the Voss contracts, and the 2 words were in a handwriting he recognized as Darnell Briggs's own. The note sent him back to the file room, to boxes that predated his current assignment, to a case that had been closed in 1949 with a conviction that Mahoney had at the time accepted without fully examining. Edward Goss, 44, convicted of embezzlement from a city contractor, 18 months served, released in 1951. The contractor listed in the case files was a subsidiary of a company that Pulaski's documents had connected, 2 transfers removed, to the same LaSalle Street holding firm. Goss had been the bookkeeper. He would have seen everything. The conviction had effectively silenced him, discredited him, removed him from any position to speak credibly about what he'd witnessed. Mahoney pulled the trial transcript. The primary witness against Goss had been a man named Thomas Carey, described as an internal auditor. Mahoney found Carey's address. He cross-referenced it. Carey's listed employer from 1948 through 1950 was a consulting firm that had received one of the no-bid city contracts from Mahoney's documents. Carey had testified against the man who could expose the conspiracy he himself was part of. Goss had gone to prison. The money had kept moving. He had the name. He had the motive, clear and financial and traceable in its broad shape, if not yet in its precise mechanism. He had the connection between the victims, the thread that ran through all 5 lives and ended at Harlan Voss, or at someone operating in Voss's direct interest. What he did not have was anything a prosecutor could place before a judge. The documents showed suspicious patterns. Patterns were not proof. The corporate connections were suggestive. Suggestion was not evidence. The 2 men on Huron Street could not be connected to Voss through anything Mahoney could currently demonstrate. Darnell Briggs's note, found in a coat pocket, was inadmissible in ways that would take a courtroom an afternoon to enumerate. He had built an architecture of understanding that was internally coherent and externally invisible. He could see the whole structure clearly. No one else could see it at all from the outside. And without physical evidence, without a witness willing to speak and capable of surviving the decision to speak, the structure existed only in his own mind, which was precisely where Harlan Voss needed it to remain. The precinct was quiet in the particular way of very late hours. One uniformed sergeant at the front, heat coming unevenly from the radiators, the smell of old coffee and floor wax. Mahoney sat at his desk with the documents laid out in their reconstructed order, the leaf preserved in an evidence envelope at the top right corner where he could see it. He'd been sitting here since midnight. The overhead light was too bright and too steady. He'd drunk 4 cups of coffee and felt none of them. He thought about Darnell Briggs reaching toward a wall that wasn't a door. He thought about Eleanor's voice reading the handwritten note, steady and unfrightened, which frightened him considerably. He thought about Forsyth's careful eyes and the Huron Street men and the green Ford and Reardon's window gazing and Harlan Voss crossing a sidewalk without looking around. He thought about the folded leaf and what the fold meant. Correspondence. The killer was communicating with him specifically. Had been since the beginning, perhaps. The case had been addressed to him all along. He just hadn't understood why yet. He was beginning to. The address Eleanor had read from Briggs's note. He'd been returning to it all night, circling it, and now he pulled the Pulaski documents and found it again in a property transfer from 1950. A warehouse on the north side, transferred to a dormant holding company, never resold, currently listed as vacant. 3 days from now. Briggs had written the date for a reason. Briggs had placed the note in Mahoney's coat for a reason, which meant Briggs had known what was coming and had tried to tell him and had been killed before the telling was complete. Mahoney stared at the address. He thought about the 5 victims and the chain of exposure each of them represented and the single gap that still existed in that chain. The one person who had seen the original transaction from close enough to testify and who had survived because he'd been discredited and imprisoned and forgotten. Edward Goss, released in 1951, current address unknown. Mahoney picked up the phone. He had 3 days. He had no badge of authority that anyone in the city was currently obligated to respect. He dialed anyway. Somewhere, Eddie Goss was still alive, for now.